Hi everyone. For this module, we'll be looking at Chapter 2 and focusing on the American federal system and the Texas state constitution. Takeaways from this chapter. To explain the American federal system of government, describe the principles of a constitutional government, to be able to describe characteristics common to state constitutions. Students should also be able to discuss the development of Texas's constitution before and after 1876, describe how political culture drives institutions, to be able to explain the state constitutions, including Texas's, and how they are amended and revised, and be able to identify some of the criticisms of the Texas Constitution. So let's begin. The American federal system of government. The federal system is defined as a government that provides for a sharing of power between the national government and the respective state government. Divisions of powers between national and state governments. The division of powers between the national and state government is complicated. Some powers are granted exclusively to the national government and others exclusively to the state. Some powers are granted to both the national and state governments. For example, if you commit a crime, it's pretty much the same everywhere you go in the country. Similarly, some powers are denied to the national government, others are denied to states, and some are denied to both. Each power has been subject to interpretation by the federal courts. The Necessary and Proper Clause versus the 10th Amendment. The Supreme Court's decision in McCulloch versus Maryland of 1819 interpreted the meaning of the Necessary and Proper Clause, otherwise known as the Elastic Clause. The 10th Amendment reserves to states powers not expressly granted to the federal government, but Article 1 gives Congress the power to pass laws which shall be necessary and proper for exercising this power. The court's broad interpretation allows Congress to decide the means to carry out ends. The decision also strengthened the Supremacy Clause of Article 6, federal government as the supreme law of the land. The Interstate Commerce Clause. With the Interstate Commerce Clause, the Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate commerce between states. Congress and the courts determine what is interstate commerce. The meaning came about to be anything that had a substantial effect on national commerce. For example, the purpose of trade barriers between states. Equal protection and due process clauses of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment extended protections in the U.S. Bill of Rights to states and local governments. Equal protection clause. States are required to treat all citizens equally. The definition of the due process law clause states that states must also follow certain rules and procedures. After World War I, states were required to provide protection in 3 areas: civil liberties, criminal proceedings, and election laws. State powers was reduced, but individual rights and liberties were expanded. The power to tax and spend to promote the general welfare of citizens. The national government lacks the power to provide many basic services, but can provide money to states and local governments to provide these services. When states accept the money, they must agree to some national standards. For example, standards tied to highway funding, right? When we get into the chapter on local governments and local city politics, we'll understand that states are essentially creatures of the national government, right? They are the go-between between local governments and national governments. Power to tax and spend to promote the general welfare of citizens. A federal system has certain advantages. 1. States can be laboratories of the democracy. 2. Individual liberties is protected from arbitrary power. 3. A diversity of public policy preferences can be accommodated. 4. The most appropriate level of government can be used for particular purposes. And lastly, states can compete to attract citizens. The evolution of American federalism. The relationship between the national and state governments changes with time and political trends. Under dual federalism, up to the Civil War, states were dominant. Under cooperative federalism, beginning with the Great Depression, the federal government supplied more money to states and local governments to provide for citizens. Beginning with the creative federalism in the 1960s, greater authority has gradually been returned to the states. The evolution of American federalism. Although greater authority has returned to the states, federal grants to states have grown. About 24% of state expenditure now comes from the federal government. Some grants, called categorical grants, have federal strings attached that specify to states where the money can and cannot be spent. This has come to be called coercive federalism. Relations between states and the federal government. The full faith and credit clause of the Constitution requires states to recognize the judgments, legislations, and public records of other states. The Privileges and Immunities Clause requires states to recognize basic rights of federal citizens even when non-residents of citizens or other states. The concept continued to be tested, such as the Obergefell v. Hodges 2015, which determined same-sex marriage to be constitutionally protected. Principles of constitutional government. There are three essential principles that form the principles of constitutional government. Three essential principles form the basis of constitutional government. 1. Popular sovereignty. This is power granted in state constitution that rests with the people. 2. Social contract theory. This is where all individuals possess inalienable rights and submit to government to protect those rights. 3. Constitutions structure government. They divide and assign power and place limitations on government's power. The idea of a limited government is, in particular, embraced by the Constitution. Characteristics common to state constitutions. The separation of powers. All state constitutions embrace the idea of separation of powers, which provides a check on the actions of government. Separation of powers means the powers divided among the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government. Checks and balances means the power granted to each branch of government, and it gives the authority to restrain other branches. Fear of a strong executive led the framers of the 1876 Texas Constitution to fragment executive power. Plural executive system is where the executive power is divided among several statewide elected offices. Here is a table of the separation of powers in the Texas government. The legislation, or the legislator, here is a table that provides you with an overview of the separation of powers in Texas government. Remember that the legislature, among proposing and passing laws, also has the power to tax and set budgets, power to impeach. The governor has limited appointed power. Constitutionally, he is a weak governor. The most powerful plural executive office is the lieutenant governor constitutionally. The governor does have the power to veto and line item veto power. The judiciary, remember, has the ability to interpret the law. They don't make the law, they interpret the law. Evolution of the Texas Constitution, 1824 to 1876. Each transitional period for the region that became Texas Evolution of the Texas Constitution, 1824 to 1876. Each transitional period for the region that became Texas necessitated the creation of a new constitution. Incorporated under Mexico, independent nation status, becoming part of the United States, upheaval before and after the Civil War. Texas's history and culture have had a significant influence on the development of each of these constitutions. Constitutions under the Republic of Mexico. The Republic of Mexico's Constitution of 1824 formed the state of Coahuila y Texas. This new state's constitution passed in 1827 and provided for a unicameral legislature with 2 elected representatives. Catholicism was designated as the state's resolution. The Republic of Texas Constitution of 1836. Texas declared itself a republic independent of Mexico in 1836 and adopted a new constitution. It was a unitary rather than federal form of government. Distinct limits were placed on executive powers. Slavery was legalized and the freedom of religion and property rights was protected. A unitary system of government is a system in which the central government controls all functions of government. Statehood Constitution of 1845. In 1845, Texas joined the United States and adopted the first Texas State Constitution. Primarily reflected the traditionalistic Southern culture with a few adaptations of Spanish law. Women granted. Statehood Constitution of 1845. In 1845, Texas joined the United States and adopted the first Texas State Constitution. It primarily reflected the traditionalistic Southern culture with a few Spanish adaptations. Women were granted property rights, homesteads protected from forced sales to pay debts, also provided for limited executive authority, biennial sessions of the legislature, and 2-year terms for most elected officials. Most features of this document would be retained for later constitutions. The Civil War and Reconstruction Constitution of 1861, 1866, and 1869. In 1861, Texas joined the Confederacy and adopted another state constitution. This constitution prohibited the freeing of slaves. In 1866, a third state constitution was approved as a condition for rejoining the Union. Under this constitution, Texas abolished slavery and nullified the ordinances of secession. The Constitution of 1869 was known as the Reconstruction or Carpetbaggers Constitution. It was a radical departure from the past and future documents. The Constitution of 1876, or the current Constitution, was written at the end of Reconstruction. Delegates at the 1875 convention were landowners who had strongly objected to the centralist government under Reconstruction. This constitution reflected anti-government sentiments of the traditionalistic, individualistic political subculture of the state, and it restricted the powers of both the legislature and the governor. Culture drives institutions. With the exception of the Reconstruction Constitution of 1869, the various Texas constitutions have all reflected Texas's preferences for limited government. Influenced by attitudes from the former Mexican government and deep-rooted Southern traditional beliefs, some elements contributed by the Spanish Constitution were nevertheless significant, such as property rights for women. Voters in Texas today continue to reject expansions of governmental power. Comparing the structures of state constitutions. Ideally, constitutions should be brief and explicit, embody general principles, and provide broad outlines subject to interpretation, especially through judicial review. Government officials should be held accountable. Amendments should be infrequent. For example, the U.S. Constitution. Vast differences exist among state constitutions, and few meet these ideal characteristics. Comparing the structure of state constitutions. Most states have had several constitutions. Most constitutions are very lengthy documents, and most have been amended more often than the United States Constitution. State constitutions have more of a limited lifespan, right? The Texas Constitution is longer than most and has more amendments, but like others, it may be more accurately described as a statutory or legislative rather than constitutional. Amending and revising state constitutions. Except in the state of Delaware, changing state constitutions involves proposing amendments and citizen approval. In Texas, 2/3 of each house must propose amendments, and a majority of the voters must approve them. 17 states allow initiative or citizen proposals that change through petitions signed by voters. Texas does not allow an initiative. Most states, including Texas, allow for a constitutional convention to propose an amendment. So, in other words, the state of Texas really doesn't want involvements from its citizens because it does not have an initiative form of participation from citizens. So the only way that people like you and me can propose an amendment is if we go to our local state legislature and propose it. And not only do we have to talk to our state representative, but we also have to talk to a state U.S. or state senator, right, in our district to bring the proposal to the floor of the entire Senate and representative chambers. So it's a very lengthy and difficult process for every individual or everyday individuals to get involved with. Amending the Texas Constitution. Amendments to the Texas Constitution have all been proposed by 2/3 vote of each house of state legislature, with 73.6% approval by the voters. Voter turnout for amendments tends to be low. Among the reasons is ballot wording, which can contribute to voter confusion and apathy. Right? Sometimes when we look at ballots and amendments, they're so wordy, right? They use long words and they're very winded and we get confused by the language. Most amendments face little opposition. Most are supported by organized interest groups who attempt to have their interests protected in the Constitution. Criticisms of the Texas Constitution. The Texas Constitution is the second largest in the nation. Much of it is unclear in outdated language. Many parts are focused on specifics rather than on-board foundations upon which the government can rest. Due to the excessive level of detail, the Constitution is both inflexible and constantly changing. For example, Article 9, the one addressing counties. New amendments tend to be incremental in nature. In other words, we tend to like very, very slow change. Takeaways to the Texas Constitution. Legal scholars argue for a general revision of the current Texas Constitution, but numerous efforts have been unsuccessful. Significant political forces do not support reform. The political culture and basic conservative nature of the state politics do not support broad change. Strong opposition from powerful lobby groups whose interests are currently protected add to difficulty, and most citizens are not excited about the prospect of a constitutional revision.